I don't want to spend a lot of time because last week we did part one. I thought I was going to cover it all in one session, and it turns out this is going to be 3 sessions. The history of Israel and the rise of the Jewish underground. Now, just to refresh your memory from last week, as I was teaching you last week, and we covered 2 of the factors, there are 4 main reasons that Jews got to the point that they had to blow the British out of Eretz Israel. The British, they look nice, they act nice, they're proper, and they are, compared to other countries in the world, they've treated us pretty well. Other than the massacres of 1290, where they banned all Jews whom they didn't kill, they threw the rest of us out of England, and we weren't allowed back in from 1290 to 1648 until Oliver Cromwell. But other than that 358-year misunderstanding where they failed to follow the international definition of anti-Semitism, and the next 500 years also, they're delightful people, assuming you like fish and chips. Now, what we learned in last week's class is that the British caused the deaths of millions of Jews during the Holocaust, indirectly. They didn't kill Jews. You heard from Professor Mordechai Kedar of Bar Ilan University, who spoke for 6 minutes explaining and laying out how even though Hitler and the Nazis were the ones whose hands murdered Jews, there were hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions who could have been saved had the British allowed Jews into the land of Israel. We understand Roosevelt did not let Jews into America, but that wasn't the land of Israel. Roosevelt also is a criminal in Jewish history. But Israel was the place, if nowhere else, the Jews should have been able to get into. And the British, we learned last week about the Struma, how it sank at sea, and the Patria, how the Haganah blew themselves up rather than be sent back to the Nazis. And we learned about the Exodus and what happened. So that had to stop. Jews had to free and open the harbors, even if it meant driving out the British. Secondly, we learned how the British literally cut down the state of Israel and truncated Israel. And I'll show you the map real quick. But first, I began the way I did because you ever go and see a movie or watch TV and there's a scene and then it says on the screen, but it wasn't always this way. So I'm going to show you something, but it wasn't always this way. And as I did last week, I warn you in advance, there's music for those of us who are strict about not listening to music during the Sefira period. There's music for educational purposes only. We're not playing Dr. Dre, not that that's music, but we're not playing any of that stuff. We're not going to play any kind of like enjoyable music per se, but we're going to have music for historical and educational purposes. So we begin right now. Here we go. Make sure I've optimized. Okay. As I say, we're beginning with something, and then we're going to respond. Then we're going to say, but it wasn't always this way. This is before he became king.
Another innovation tonight, the national anthem. The printed order of service includes a translation of God Save the Queen into Hebrew, which I'm told was done for a service marking the Queen's coronation. God save our gracious Queen, long live our Queen, God save the Queen. Send her victorious, happy and glorious, long to reign over us. God save the Queen. And now the Israeli national anthem will be sung in Hebrew.
ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא הווה והוא יהיה בתפארה
So as you could see, the Jews and the British have worked it out. And King Charles III, may he reign peacefully and successfully, has actually charted a very, very fine record of being a friend of Israel and a friend of the Jewish people. But it wasn't always that way. As we were learning last week, and we continue from here, the state of Israel was supposed to be this. This is what the League of Nations gave England. All of what is now blue here was the state of Israel as it was supposed to be. That's the Golan Heights. This little white spot is the Lake of Kinneret, the Galilee, the Sea of Galilee. Then there's a line down the Jordan River. And then there's the Salt Sea, the Yam HaMelach, near where you see Masada when you go to Masada. Note these two spots. I'll point it out again to you in a few moments. All of this was the state of Israel as it was supposed to be. And the Arabs demanded a two-state solution. And the British, who had been given this mandate, the British mandate, by virtue of, remember we learned last week about the Balfour Declaration. So Britain had been given the Sinai and Egypt after World War I, as well as Iraq. And the French were given Syria and Lebanon. And that's why people from Syria and Lebanon, Morocco, Yemen, they speak French. And that's why in Israel, they speak English. Had France been given the Palestine Mandate, the Jews of Israel today would be speaking French. And we would have trouble communicating with them if we're not fluent in Hebrew. It worked out that way. The British took this land of Israel, and for their purposes in 1922, they kept it 5 years, and in 1922, they created a two-state solution. They tore off all that is yellow or gold and made an Arab country that never existed in history, and it didn't even have a name, so they called it Transjordan. And it was only years later, 25 years later, that it became Jordan. The country of Jordan is a fake country. By now it's real. It was created artificially by the British from the land of Israel. They truncated 78% of Israel to create a two-state solution. The gold and yellow is the Arab country with Amman. That's from the name of the biblical name Ammon. It was the land of Ammon, part of Eretz Yisrael. As I said, here's the Dead Sea, the Jordan River, and the Sea of Galilee, the Lake of Kinneret. Moshe Rabbeinu is buried on this side, on the mountain of Nevo, just on the eastern side of the Jordan. And they gave Israel only 22% of what she was supposed to have. And then, that's 1922. And it was certified at the San Remo Conference. This includes, by the way, Judea Samaria, what the Arabs call the West Bank. That was, even they agreed in San Remo 1920 that this remains part of Israel. And then, in 1947, the United Nations took what was left of the two-state solution, and they gave all the green to the Arabs. They gave the Arabs much of the Galilee. They gave the Arabs Judea and Samaria, part of borderline Beersheba, Hebron, Beit Lechem. They internationalized Jerusalem, Ramallah. Israel had only this very narrow strip, which is where most Israelis would live, in Tel Aviv and Haifa up north. In between Tel Aviv and Haifa is Hadera. Tel Aviv Yaffo, of course. Yaffo was given to the Arabs, even though it's part of Tel Aviv. And Israel was given a desert. Give the Jews the desert. Now it's different. Jews did magic, God did magic when the Jews were given the desert. But the anti-Semites gave us the desert. That's what they could have. And so, bringing us back from where we left off last week, this was what Israel was supposed to be and was created to be. It was cut off, so it was only this two-state solution. And then the two-state solution left us with this. So what the British had done is not only had they been accomplices in a way to the deaths of millions of Jews by keeping the borders closed, but they kept tearing up the country. They had to go. They had to be driven out. This land, Palestine, the term Palestine was given the land by Rome. The Romans named it Palestine when they expelled us in the year 135 with the fall of Beitar, with the intention of destroying all connections between the Jews and the land of Israel. So the land would no longer be called Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael, Israel, but would be named for the previous people in the Bible who lived there, the Philistines. So they named it Palestine for Philistine, the Philistines. That's where the name comes from. But for 2,000 years, from the time of the expulsion in 135 through the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, Palestine always meant Israel. And to show you how much Jews called it Palestine, and when a Jew said Palestine, the whole world knew Palestine means Israel. For example, the English language daily newspaper of the Jews in Israel was the Palestine Post. Now it's called the Jerusalem Post. Some of us, when the newspaper was being edited by left-wingers, we used to call it the Palestine Post. It was sort of like a tongue-in-cheek thing. The Palestine Post was the Jewish Post. It was Jerusalem Post. The Irgun, the Jewish underground, raised money in America under a group called the American League for a Free Palestine. The American League for a Free Palestine. That's not Arabs for a free Palestine. That's the Chacham, the wise son. They were advertising for money. They were always raising money around Pesach time for a free Palestine. What we call the United Jewish Appeal used to be called the United Palestine Appeal. You may be able to tell, in fact, it's the same artist that was hired both by the American League for a Free Palestine and the United Palestine Appeal. His name is Arthur Schick. The American League for a Free Palestine put together a play by the author and playwright Ben Hecht. Ben Hecht is famous. He wrote one of the great movie comedies, The Front Page. He wrote Gunga Din. He wrote several of the funniest movies. He was a very, very famous news reporter in Chicago. And there's a whole story of how he became involved with the Irgun. I'll mention it in a moment. And of course, the Zionist Organization of America, the ZOA, they advertised, help free Palestine. Palestine was Israel. The biggest Zionists were freeing Palestine. The Ben Hecht story. So Ben Hecht goes to a producer, raising money for the, what happened was he was approached by the American League of Free Palestine, their two leaders, Hillel Cook and Samuel Bergson. And they were looking for Jews in Hollywood. They were looking for Jews to help them raise money. And where are you going to find big money? They were trying to raise money for the Irgun. And so they went to Ben Hecht. And Hecht said, you went to the wrong Jew. I'm barely a Jew. I'm an American. I'm not interested in Palestine, for God's sakes. I'm interested in the Front Page. I'm interested in Gunga Din. I'm not interested in Palestine. So they said, you're not an American, you're a Jew who lives in America. He said, no, I'm an American. So they made a deal with him. They said, tell you what, will you agree to the following? You pick the people. Pick any 3 people in Hollywood you like. And with us listening in on the phone, ask each of the 3 people, you pick them. Hi, Ben Hecht here. This is a crazy question, but I've got a bet going on. What do you consider me? You consider me a Jew? Or do you consider me an American? And he said, okay. And he called 3 big shots in Hollywood. And each one of them said, what kind of question is that? You're a Jew. And he was shocked. He was so shocked that when he put down the phone after the 3rd guy, he said, sign me up with the Irgun. And he started raising millions of dollars for the Irgun. So we learned last week those 2 things. And about the rise of the Jewish underground, because we've got to drive out the people that have done this to us and that have closed our borders. But there's more that the British did. In 1929, there were several Arab massacres. We don't remember it now. The Arabs went around massacring and pogroming Jews in Eretz Yisrael in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And there was no Jewish state. Like now we're told, well, the reason they do it is because they want a Palestine, just for peace, 2-state solution for the 4th time, and they'll be nice. Well, there was a time that there was no Israel altogether, and they did the same thing. In fact, it was worse because there was no Jewish army to stop them. In 1929, the Arabs massacred the Jews of Hebron. Jews used to live in Hebron. Hebron is where Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, our forefathers, our patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, are buried in Ma'arat HaMachpelah, the cave of Machpelah in Hebron. And there was a yeshiva there, the Yeshivat Hebron. And one day in August 1929, the Arabs ran wild and they started killing and massacring Jewish men, women, and children. There was no Jewish state. What were they fighting? Why were they doing that? Massacre of women, children in Hebron told by refugees. Arab horde slaughtered little children during mad orgy in city. This is the memorial today in Hebron. If you ever visit, Ellen Zichrona Livracha and I were visiting. We were here. They have the faces of the 67 people that were massacred. And when I say massacred, they were cut to pieces. When Arabs get started, they get started. This was the Yeshiva Hebron. They destroyed the yeshiva. They tore up the Torahs. They tore up the holy books. 1929. It wasn't the only massacre. 47 dead in Jerusalem riot, attacks by Arabs. You could tell by the layout of this newspaper, it's the New York Times. 47 dead in Jerusalem riot, attacks by Arabs spread. British troops rushed to city. Martial law proclaimed. Where were the British before the 47 were massacred? Where were the British before the 16? The British did not want to anger the Arabs, and they knew what the Arabs were doing and planning, and they only would come in sort of like during pogroms under the Tsar. First there was the pogrom, and then at the end they would come to put an end to the pogrom. Jews were not able to protect ourselves. It was against the law for the Jews to have weapons. Any Jew found with a firearm could be arrested and hanged, literally hanged at the gallows. So Jews were not allowed to protect ourselves. People knew massacres were coming, and the British didn't stop them. Arab massacre told by nurse. The thrilling eyewitness story of how 3,000 Arabs, shooting and stabbing everyone they met, swooped down on Jerusalem, was told here today by Mrs. Jacob Schroeder, public health nurse just returned from Palestine. Shudders at her memories of the reign of terror in the holy city when the Arab hordes rushed in to spread death and destruction. She was working as a nurse in the hospital in Jerusalem operated by Hadassah Hospital, when the first wounded were brought in. Albany Evening News, Arab outbreaks in Palestine spread. Stimson demands British protection for citizens of the United States. Stimson was the American Secretary of State. And, well, forget about the Jews who are Israeli or living in Palestine, but there are American citizens there, and they've got to be protected. We as Americans demand that you protect our citizens in Palestine. Who did he demand it from? The British. The British were not protecting us, and they weren't allowing us to protect ourselves. Arabs burned city of Tzfat. 22 killed, scores wounded. Syrians invade from north. All the news that's fit to print. This is what went on. The British advertised in England for people to come and serve and make a career as Palestine police. Some Palestine police wore this uniform. It's warm weather. If you ever saw the movie Exodus, 1960 movie Exodus, starring Paul Newman and Eva Marie Saint, you'll recall a lot of them dressed like this. In Cyprus, for example, where they were holding Jews in displaced person camps. Or maybe you get a higher position and you get to dress like that. So make a career as the Palestine police. One more memory of the British. In addition to the massacres that they did not protect us from, and again, they hanged Jews that they found carrying weapons, there was the incident of they would not allow Jews basic Jewish rights. Let me explain what I mean. You see here a picture of a man blowing a shofar. He's wearing a talit. He's wearing a shofar, and you could see it looks like it might be the Western Wall. I want to bring you this story. You may never have heard about this before. Let's find. But first, as I bring you the story of the shofar and the Western Wall, it was against this backdrop that the Irgun was founded. And as I showed you last, that this is the anthem of the Irgun. I did it last week. I'm not going to play all the anthems of the Haganah and the Lechi. I did that last week, but just the Irgun. It has the English words. And the thrust of it, there's a thing about the story of the Irgun anthem. It was written by a Irgun soldier named Michael Ashbel. And he writes it to the woman that he hopes to marry. Her name is Sarah Eisenberg. Michael Ashbel, Sarah Eisenberg. And the lyrics of the song go like this. Today, my young Sarah, the translation is not perfect, mine is. Today, my young Sarah, I'm going to war. I'm going to carry a Sten, S-T-E-N. That's a kind of rifle, the Sten gun. Sarah, Haktana, Yipared B'Tzeitila Milchama, Et Hamduna L'chonen B'Shtei Gadot HaYarden. I'm going to war to create a Jewish state on both sides of the Jordan River, because that's what it's supposed to be. And he continues, B'Shtei Gadot HaYarden, Kizazi Saratech, V'Chigri Et Chagoratech, Chapkini Kechi Mikla V'Itila Shura. You know, if you like Sarah, why don't you cut your long hair a little bit shorter so that so you can go to the front, the battlefront with me. The long hair like you have, you won't be able to fight well. Get a haircut, grab a Sten gun, and come and join with me at the battlefield. Ale barricadot, let's mount the barricades. Because Cherut Nisa B'dam Va'esh, freedom will be won with blood and fire. And the second of the two stanzas, and if I die in battle, if the British arrest me and hang me, because this was a real thing going on. If I die and I'm hanged, don't cry. That was my fate. Instead, pick another guy in the Irgun battle unit of mine and marry him instead. Ale barricadot, onto the barricades. What ended up happening, I don't know whether we'll get to the Akko prison break today or next week. During the Akko fortress prison break, Michael Ashbel was killed. Sarah followed the lyrics of the song, and she married Eitan Livni, another member of the Irgun unit. And she and Eitan Livni gave birth to a girl who grew up to be Tzipi Livni, Prime Minister of Israel a few years ago. I want to make the point while you're looking at the screen one more moment. Again, this is the insignia of the Irgun. Aleph Tzadi Lamed, Etzel standing for Irgun Tzva'i Leumi, National Military Organization. They show a hand holding a rifle, a Sten, with the slogan Rak Kach, only this way. And it's superimposed on the map of what Israel should have been. And there, as I pointed out to you, the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, and the Dead Sea. This man is Zev Jabotinsky. Zev Jabotinsky is the father of the Jewish underground. Jabotinsky was a poet and a writer of novels in Russia, in Odessa, in the late 1890s, early 1900s. He was completely assimilated. He was another one like Ben-Hur, had no Jewish identity at all. He was a writer. People said great writers in Russia thought he would be another Tolstoy. He was an extraordinary writer. In 1905, there were pogroms in Odessa that were horrific and that massacred the Jews in Odessa. Jabotinsky came out of those riots a changed man. Something in him burst out, and he created a Jewish defense organization, the JDO, Jewish Defense Organization. He arranged for the illegal arms to be gotten to Jews in Odessa to fight back. And he changed his life. He stopped focusing on writing and on poetry. He continued writing some poetry, by the way, in 14 different languages, I believe. He was literate in something like 14 different languages. And it's one thing to be literate, another thing to be writing poetry. And what happened is he eventually moved to Israel, became the leader of one of the Jewish Zionist movements, what they call the revisionist movement. He was the right-wing, but liberal, classic liberalism, like sort of today's Likud. A strong believer against socialism. Ben-Gurion was a socialist, and the first leaders of Israel that you've heard of were all socialists. Golda Meir, Moshe Dayan, Shimon Peres, Yitzhak Rabin, Yigal Allon, they were all socialists. And Jabotinsky believed that the Jewish state should not be socialist. And so he formed the revision. He revised Zionism to be non-socialist. And he argued that we need to be strong. In 1921, there were Jerusalem riots, like what I've taught you earlier today, pogroms by Arabs, and Jabotinsky organized, just as he had organized Jews in Odessa, he organized Jews to defend themselves. And of course, the British arrested him. And the British sentenced him to something like 20 years in prison. And there was an international outcry, even by the socialist Jews, because the feeling was, look, we have our politics for another day. This guy led the defense, saved who knows how many hundreds of lives by organizing the defense, and now you're putting him in prison? And so the British worked out a compromise. We will commute his prison sentence, but we're expelling him from Israel. And for the rest of his life, he's never allowed back into Israel. So they expelled him from Israel. And he had no choice in the matter. He was sentenced into exile, and he wrote a will. And in his will, he was so sure one day the British will be driven out and there will be an independent country. He left in his will, wherever I die, wherever they bury me, I would like my bones to be brought back for burial in Israel, but only by the order of a Jewish government in Israel. He died in 1941, and eventually a Jewish government of Israel 7 years later came into being. It was headed by Ben-Gurion, who despised him and refused to order to let his bones come back. And then in the late 1950s, the new Prime Minister of Israel gave the order to bring Jabotinsky back. He's now buried on Mount Herzl, which is the equivalent of Arlington National Cemetery, in like right near the area where Herzl is buried. So his face is up there. He was the founder of the Jewish underground. And let's just go, we're going to go now into a little more about Jabotinsky, but first, we are now seeing the major reasons that the Jews formed an underground. The British sealed off Israel's harbors, consigning hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Jews to death. The British continually truncated the Jewish national home. 1920, severing 78% east of Jordan. The 1947 UN partition plan, truncating Israel even further. The British failure to protect Jews from Arab massacres, while arresting Jews who fought back and even hanging Jews who defended with arms. And arbitrary British bans on fundamental Jewish rights in Israel, such as the ban on blowing the shofar at the kotel. Let's go into that now.
Rabbi?
Yes, please.
Quickly. So you've been emphasizing the Irgun as, I guess, are they the precursor to ID? Is it because they're the precursor to IDF?
The Haganah are the main precursor to the IDF. The Haganah were the main group under Ben Gurion's labor government, and they were the by far and away the largest underground group. We played their anthem, in fact, last week and spoke about them first.
Right.
With the Irgun Lechi were different.
Cooperation between the groups, were they all just going willy-nilly, the three?
It's very interesting. For a period of time, they cooperated, and then after the King David Hotel bombing, which we'll be learning about, if not today, next week, depending on how the program progresses, they announced something called the season, like hunting rabbit season. And they made a deal with the British that they would help hunt down members of the Irgun and the Lechi. And it's probably one of the most heartbreaking, if not disgusting, aspects of Jewish history, that the Haganah were concerned. Ben Gurion really hated Jabotinsky, and he didn't want any other underground operating in Israel. And so at the time before the state of Israel was created. And there would not have been an Irgun and Lechi if the Haganah were doing some of those things. And in order to subdue any political opposition and competition, if there ever would be a state, he had his people hunt down the Irgun and Lechi. So we're focusing on the Irgun and Lechi, and their leaders are going to be people like Menachem Begin and Yitzchak Shamir, and they are the progenitors of the Likud, of the modern day government of Israel. The IDF, after 1948, members of the Irgun joined the IDF and members of the Lechi. The IDF had a policy that they did not allow many Irgun leaders into the IDF, but many, many others like Eitan Livni. I mentioned this guy Livni who married the lady that was with the guy who wrote the song. Eitan Livni became an officer in the IDF, and many IDF officers had been formerly in the Irgun. Thank you for the question. Let's go forward. Thank you very much for your question. Oops, let me bring up the YouTube. Okay, let's get that over there.
At the end of May 1934, Ze'ev Jabotinsky came to the Eclair Tirage Studios in Paris and delivered a speech in front of a movie camera. In the first 3 rows, he sat several family members and friends. They were the audience. The director yelled, "Action!" And, turning to the viewers, Jabotinsky asked,
Was hat die englische Regierung in jenem Moment gemeint mit dem Ausdruck Nationalheim?
Occasionally, he rifled through the papers in front of him, using diagrams and graphs to illustrate his ideas. The film was meant to be distributed and screened simultaneously in various countries throughout the world. But it is not clear whether this indeed happened.
Große Figur mit dem Fragezeichen ist die Film in Diagrammen
Until then, only a few people had tried to use the medium of film to disseminate an organized doctrine, like that presented by Jabotinsky with regard to a broad spectrum of political and security issues, using a dense tapestry of demographic and social data as well as economic issues. Everything came together in this speech. Everything led to one firm conclusion. The Jews must come to Eretz Yisrael urgently.
En für mir, lasst uns frei kolonisieren.
These things were said only 1 year after the Nazis rose to power and long before the skies of Europe darkened and storm clouds covered the continent. Jabotinsky's words were prophetic. They were said out of a deep understanding of historic and political processes and a clear and knowledgeable awareness of demographic processes, including a correct reading of the world map and political trends. The film, whose quality after 70 years is surprising and deeply moving, has been preserved at the Jabotinsky Institute.
I mentioned Jabotinsky was a poet. He wrote, among his many poetries, his many poems, and his writings, he wrote two incredibly powerful songs that related to the rise and that inspired the underground. By the way, Israel ultimately issued a 100 shekel Jabotinsky note. That's just like in the United States, you have Washington, Lincoln, Alexander Hamilton, whoever they're putting on some of them now. So Jabotinsky's the 100 shekel note. He's also different stamps were issued on different occasions. He's a major figure in Israeli history. And a lot of us haven't heard of him. And that's why I'm teaching about him. There are streets named for Jabotinsky. And in my office, this poster exists as well. Now, Jabotinsky, these words are very stylish. It basically says, Tzion kula shalanu. All of Zion belongs to us, both sides of the Jordan River. All of it. He wrote a song that I'm going to tell you about. You know, in the United States, we Americans have the Alamo. Remember the Alamo, the great fort that fell. And that became a rallying cry that gave rise to the birth of the state of Texas and the effort by the United States under, I believe it was President Polk, to annex Texas. Remember the Alamo. Israel has at least 3 Alamos. Beitar. In the year 135, it was the last defense against the Romans before we were exiled from the land of Israel. You all have heard of Masada, and that was in the year 67 to 70. And then 65 years later, Jews again had risen in strength, and under the fight under Bar Kokhba, they were fighting for the last place, the last fortress, Mitzudat Beitar, the fortress of Beitar. This is another of Beitar. By the way, nowadays, Beitar has been rebuilt, not as a fortress, but as a so-called Jewish settlement in occupied Arab territory. Jews now live again in Beitar after 2,000 years. The Talmud in Yerushalmi says, the Romans killed them continuously until the horse was immersed in blood up to his nose. The blood was moving rocks of 40 sailloads until the blood colored the sea for 4 meal. They said 300 children's brains were found on 1 stone. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says 500 schools were in Beitar. The smallest one was not less than 500 children. So what would that be? That would be 250,000 children. The evil Hadrian had a large vineyard. He fenced it in with the slain of Beitar. He took their bodies of the slain of Beitar and made a fence out of them, standing them up with outstretched arms. and ruled they should not be buried. It was only under another king who finally decided they should be buried. So Beitar was one of them. And Jabotinsky would rally his people, like, remember the Alamo, remember Beitar, and remember Yodafat. The fortress of Yodafat Siege of Yodafat was a 47-day siege by Roman forces in the year 67, just before Masada, led by Roman General Vespasian and his son Titus, both future emperors. The siege ended with the sacking of the town, the death of most of its inhabitants, and the enslavement of the rest. It was the second bloodiest battle of the revolt, surpassed only by the siege of Yerushalayim, and the longest except for Yerushalayim and Masada. 40,000 Jews were slain or committed suicide, and 1,200 women and infants were taken into slavery, while the Romans suffered but a single fatality. Vespasian ordered the town demolished and its walls torn down. The Romans again prohibited burial of the fallen, and it was only a year or more later when Jews were allowed to return to bury the remains in caves. And that's a memorial today, Yad Zichron, to those who were to Lamaganei Yodefat. It's a memorial to those who defended Yodefat. And of course, Masada. If you've been to Israel, you undoubtedly have visited Masada. Fortress Masada, you know the story. Jabotinsky wrote a song, his anthem, about Beitar, and the anthem goes like this. The theme is the fallen fortresses will rise again, like remember the Alamo. From the depths of dust and decay, with blood and sweat, there will arise for us a people proud, generous, and fierce. The mountain fortress Beitar, which was captured, as were mountain fortresses Yodefat and Masada, will arise again. Second stanza. Now the last word in this first stanza is Hadar. It will arise with strength and Hadar, glory. So the second stanza begins with the same word that the first stanza ends. Hadar, despite Jewish blood now being spilled like water, and Jews being denigrated throughout the world, Jews are a people of Davidic nobility. The Hebrew, even in poverty, is a prince. Even if a servant or serf, you were created the son of a king, adorned with the diadem of King David. In light or in secret, remember the crown of nobility and of challenge. And that word tagar starts the third stanza. We must persist for each and every obstacle and impediment, whether success or setback. With the flame of the revolt, raise a fire to proclaim, it doesn't matter. Any setback, it's no matter, keep going. Because silence and concession is foul, contemptible for those made of blood and soul, for the hidden glory, to die or to conquer the mountain, Yodefat Batsada Beitar. And he ends with the word Beitar, which is how, so each stanza works that way. And this was the anthem of the underground, and it was sung not too long ago, about 10, 15 years ago, this particular clip, by the leaders of the state of Israel. The man on the left with the white hair was the Speaker of the Knesset at the time, Dov Shalansky, and that's Yaakov Meridor, who at the time was a minister in the Israeli government. man on the left, Yitzchak Shamir, was the prime minister of Israel. A moment ago, they had the picture of Ariel Sharon, who at the time was minister of defense. The other of the two songs of Jabotinsky I'm bringing for you today as we move forward, running low on time. So the other song that was a theme of the underground was Shtei Gadot, two banks of the Jordan River. Again, Jabotinsky did not accept the two-state solution that gave Jordan 78% of Israel. As a bridge has a beam in its center and a spine is in the middle of a man, so my land has an axis line in its center. It's the Jordan River. Namely, there are two banks to the Jordan River, the West Bank and the East Bank. This one's ours, and so is that. Though my land is small and minute, it's still mine from its head to its lower end, stretching east from the Mediterranean Sea to the Yeshimon Desert east of Moab and Jordan, and the Jordan is in the middle. There are two banks to the Jordan. This one's ours, and so is that. All will prosper there with plenty and riches, including Arabs, Christians, and my son, because my flag represents purity and decency, and it will purify both banks of the Jordan. I dedicate my two hands to my homeland, my two hands to protect and defend. May my right hand forget her cunning if I ever forget the Jordan's left side. Shtei Gadot, and remember again, just so that you have that picture again, where the Jordan lays out in the land of Israel. What did we say? When we looked at the map, we saw just a little quick scrolling, good review of today's class. Just remember, this was the land of Israel. This is the land, and this is the Jordan. It's not even in the middle. The middle would be here. It's on the side. And so he was singing both sides of the Jordan. The East and the West Bank belong to us. And this was the song of Shtei Gadot, the two banks of the Jordan River. Let me just get it up there right now. Okay.
Share.
Well, it's now about 12:04 here on the West Coast. I have certainly a lot more material for next week. So we will next week, just to give you the sense of what we'll be covering, because I like to honor my promise to let you plan your Sundays, knowing that these will be done at 12 noon Pacific time. We will begin with film of what happened at the Kotel, where the British banned Jews from blowing the shofar. Jews were not allowed to blow a shofar as long as the British occupied the land of Israel. And there's like some incredible film. I have interviews with survivors in their 70s, 80s. I think one guy might have been in his 90s. People who, when they were teenagers, there was every year at Rosh Hashanah time, there would be an underground effort to blow the shofar and to smuggle shofars into the Kotel area. And it's quite a story. It's about 10 minutes. We'll do it next week. And with that background of how the British closed the borders, truncated the land of Israel, refused to let Jews defend ourselves while massacres were going on, and suppressed Jewish civil rights, we then go straight into film clips and footage of the Irgun and the Lechi and the rise of the state of Israel. So I hope you can be with me again next week. Will, God willing, again at 11 a.m. Pacific time for the conclusion of our program. Thank you so very, very much for being here, and have a wonderful week.